Art of the Medical Deal talked about this earlier. Extremely important for entrepreneurs to understand the different types of healthcare systems, how they're working with you, how they're not working with you. Should they be working with you? What are the strategies? Honestly, I could come up with a couple 500 questions that I guarantee you Matthew has come up with. So we have an incredible session here. Matthew Holt, co-chairman of Health 2.0, lives around the corner supposedly from here.
The only reason I got invited, right?
And the only, I got this thing, why am I not there? Fun fact about Matthew, his first 4 concerts were The Tubes, Led Zeppelin, Thin Lizzy, and Queen. His life has been downhill ever since. We're hoping it's going to pick up today. Thanks.
Thanks, Jill, especially today, because I skipped out on the panel about health technology companies that lost and ran into a brick wall and failed dismally, because I went to see the England team play their World Cup game where they lost. Failed dismally, going home on the next bus. Anyway, I've got my England freelance shirt on if you want to. There you go. All right. Anyway, so we're not going to talk about dismal failures, at least hopefully not, in this panel. What we're going to talk about is where the money is in American healthcare. And I spent a lot of time back in the day with my mentor Ian Morrison at Institute for the Future. And he said, lovely Scottish accent, he said, the money in American healthcare is in the wrong place. And he's right. The money in American healthcare is in big hospitals, it's in high-priced specialists, and it's in medical devices. And that's where all the money in American healthcare is. And that's why we don't have the kind of healthcare system that does great primary care, great preventative care, great all the stuff that kind of in the digital health 2.0 world we want to get to. But we haven't had that. But you guys, Darren Dworkin from Cedars-Sinai, and Ina Sawyer from, I finally one day will get her name right, from UCSF, are kind of representative of where the money is, right? But you two are, maybe not in your particular part of it, you both represent large organizations that both have huge Epic installations that cost many more times than the total revenue of anybody in the room, and most of the room that we talk about on their own. They've both been through a couple of failures in their own EMR implementations over their history, although after you got there, I know, Cedars-Sinai. But the real issue is they're now changing what they're doing, and like Mayo, are starting to figure out how to work with startups. So I'm going to actually just ask you both to very quickly talk a little bit, not so much about your organization as a whole, but about your Center for Digital Health Innovation, Ina, and Darren, about Summation and the role you're playing with new startups. So give us a sense about what you're doing overall.
Okay, well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm at UCSF in the Center for Digital Health Innovation, and I think the main thing we should do is be really careful not to talk about soccer during this session. It's a little touchy, but we'll get a kick out of it. Just don't penalize us. So what is the goal? The goal is to talk, sorry.
Stop being foul. All right, we should stop this.
So what I would like to say is we have very different models, so I'm hoping we can give you some different examples about maybe ways to facilitate an engagement or interaction and different levels of that interaction if you're approaching a large medical center or healthcare delivery system. In our Center for Digital Health Innovation at UCSF, we have a 4-pillar model. We support innovation, internal and external. We support validation or evaluation. We think that's very important, not just for our own technologies we build on the front lines, but we really want to support the evaluation and validation of technologies being built on the outside. We're very strongly supportive of interoperability and integrated solutions, so working hard in that arena. And then also education, so that we're building innovators and problem solvers, not just technologies as we go along. So that's a quick summary of how our model is set up.
So in practical terms, what does that actually mean? So you have a center, you have a director, you're an associate director, you have some staff. What do you actually, you get up on Monday morning and what do you actually do?
Well, I might not have gone to bed Sunday night. So I'm also a clinician, so clinician innovator, and so we wear several hats there. But what I would say is, I think if I could just focus on what it would be like for startups coming to us, at least initially, and then we can maybe expand from there. So I don't spend too much time talking about things that might not be of interest to the group. I think when we have startups come to us, they're usually maybe 5 different categories they come to us, approaching us for. And we are very interested in partnering and building the bridges between health and technology or academic industry relations. So please, I hope you'll find it an open door. Now we have to figure out what does that mean and how can we relate. Usually if a startup comes to us, they're looking for, number one, domain expertise, perhaps study design, perhaps to engage in a pilot, or they may be looking for a customer, a paying customer, and rarely, but something we're really open to, is a co-development partner. So there are usually 5 categories that startups come to us for, and so the models are really different for each of those, but we have the capacity to handle any of those. And I speak a lot, I advise at outside incubators, and I speak a lot to startups, and I encourage them to think about planning for evaluation the minute they step to the whiteboard and building in a line item in their budget for it, because it should be a part of the arc of development, just like marketing, engineering, all those other components that are part of the overhead. But it does cost money. And when you come to the center to get something evaluated or validated, the first thing will be scoping it out, doing study design, and finding out how much would it cost to implement that. There are lots of types of evaluation that you start really early that actually don't cost money, including focus interviews, et cetera. But do consider it a line item in your budget, because you want to demonstrate effectiveness in care and cost by the time you're through your proof of concept. It's going to be more and more important because consumers are asking, but the funders are asking us now, does this thing work?
So, Darren, in contrast a little bit, you actually are the CIO, you actually have the main enterprise part under your wing, but then you also have this fund. So explain a bit why does CEDARS have a fund in the first place? Why do you need to do that? And then what are you trying to do with it?
Well, I'll talk a little bit sort of around sort of the journey. And so I think, Cedars-Sinai is a lot of things, and I would sort of be remiss if I didn't mention that it does a lot of things really, really great. But at the other end of the spectrum, at the end of the day, it is a large academic medical institution that sort of has some of its sort of bureaucratic barriers sort of around it. And so after we did sort of some of our big technology implementations, we really started to look around for how to sort of fill in that white space. And when we discovered that there weren't a set of mature vendors, that sort of led us to work with a lot of early stage or sort of startup companies. And one of our early observations in working with those startup companies is we weren't very good at it. I think the startup companies often struggled, but more than that, we were a big, stodgy old academic medical center that was used to sales cycles that can last anywhere from 6 months to 18 months. It would not be uncommon for us to sort of fly people across the country only to change our mind and say, oh, we want to move the meeting, or maybe it was one of 15 meetings. And so we really started to look internally at why weren't we seeing more innovative companies coming to interact with us. When we looked externally, it wasn't because there was a lack of companies out there or a lack of ideas, just we didn't think there was sort of the right bridge. And so it's a longer story of, frankly, fully how we entered there, but ultimately what we landed on was creating sort of internally a venture fund. And the idea of the venture fund, which is live today, it's Summation Health Ventures, but an $80 million fund. Its purpose is not to sort of fill the traditional spot of a financial venture fund. And we refer to it as a strategic fund, but I think since that word's sort of often used, I'd sort of explain it in this way. What we really do is we start all of our conversations the same way we always have, which is we look for companies that are solving a problem, and we convince ourselves that the company is a good fit to solve a problem for us. Many times, we'll simply become a customer of that company, and that's fine. But on occasion, we'll find a company that we think not only can solve a problem for us, but we really think that if we work closer with them, it can solve a problem for everybody. And so that's usually the category by which we'll partner with them. And what we learned is that by trying to use some of the traditional mechanisms of sort of co-development, it really was a hard match to sort of take an entrepreneurial company and sort of stick them in the middle of an academic medical center. But if we sort of leave them sort of alone and frankly actually save them from ourselves, we sort of can actually watch them sort of grow a lot faster. The last thing I'll sort of add to that is that one of the key ingredients that we've stumbled upon, because I don't think we knew this initially, was that the real value wasn't just the money that we provided, although certainly to any young company that's always very helpful. The real value was sort of the wet lab or the sort of quick testing of some of their ideas in very real and practical terms. And so the more we can create sort of some of those bridges with our partner companies, the better things are turning out.
So I want to dive into that a bit, but before we get there, how much money are you handing over? in terms of investment? Are you doing it on your own, with others? Does it have to be to somebody you're going to engage as a vendor right then and there? Just give me a flavor of what that actually looks like, that engagement, and which areas are you doing it in? And what do you think about this as well?
Sure. Well, there's a few parts to that. So the first part of that question, I think that in terms of how much we'll sort of put in, it really sort of depends. We'll look at stuff as early as sort of, I guess, what is traditionally called sort of seed stage, and we'll go all the way up to sort of Series A and sort of Series B. But ultimately, what we're really looking for are companies that we truly believe we're going to use. And so our big differentiator is that if we don't think it's something that Cedars-Sinai is ultimately going to install and use and leverage, we're not really that interested in the space. As to how we find it, I'll sort of describe this sort of in two ways. The theoretical version is like any good big academic medical center. We've had meetings and we produce PowerPoints and we have governance committees and they produce beautiful slides to talk about sort of our 6 areas and all the buzzwords that you would expect. And you can imagine they say things like big data and analytics and patient engagement. And so we have all of those pieces that we know where we want to focus. But the reality is that we just talk to a lot of people and we talk to a lot of companies. And when we find a good team with a good company that convinces our internal advisors or internal staff that it's filling a need, we sort of make sort of the decision based on there. And sure enough, that almost always relays back to something on that PowerPoint of whether it was patient engagement or analytics.
Yeah, and you said earlier that it's papering around the cracks of stuff you've already got, and you probably don't need to replicate what Epic's doing internally and some other things. So, Anna, give us a sense about how, again, you think about that selection process, and I want to dive after that into what evaluation really means for both of you.
Yeah, and I do want to say that as much as the world is on a learning curve about digital health and new technologies, we are as well at the academic medical centers. We've had long-standing committees on surgical devices. It's the HTAP committee. You wouldn't want us to take in new things every day and try them out in the OR. So these devices get actually vetted for quite a process. We haven't had such a good process for digital health. We now do. We have the technology advisory group that will be helping with that process. Besides just people to screen and vet, we actually had to create a process and even an understanding of what's a checklist for an outside company trying to engage with us, whether it's a pilot or whether as a paying customer. So that includes things now like the NDA, the BAA, a CHR, an IRB, and the security vetting process that you'll need to go through. So we're very busy trying to create processes that will actually facilitate us building relationships much easier for you as they get defined. So just to encourage you, because I know we do get looked at as not being as agile as we could be, but we're working hard on that. Your input to that process would be helpful too. What works, what hasn't worked, et cetera. I think it's really interesting because where we sit, of course, is sort of like a magnet with iron filings as far as digital health technology right now. So as an institution, I probably speak to 6 to 10 companies a week. I think that might shift now that he has $80 million and we're asking you for money if you want something done. So that may not be an issue, but we actually do want to engage. I think you had a follow-up question.
Well, so I was going to ask about valuation, but let me just preface that a little bit because you guys are on the West Coast. You're in the middle of you're about a block and a half away from our office, and there's a bunch of people rock else across the street. A bunch of people around you in that area. You can see, if you go to Caltrain, you'll see some new tech company you never heard of has plastered the walls and the posts and everything else with their latest gizmo. And so you're right, you are in the thick of it. Close to Sand Hill, Stanford has a similar background. You guys have now got money, there is stuff going on in LA. We've been running, Health 2.0 in New York City has been running a program called Pilot Health Tech New York, which is basically helping the world's biggest, oldest, stuffiest academic medical centers, who are the ones in New York up and down Fifth Avenue, get in the game as well. And that actually doesn't come out of their great desire to come out and find out about health tech. They're the last people in America who want to change. Where that's come from is the New York City Economic Development Corp. That's Michael Bloomberg in his day, deciding that New York needs to also rival Silicon Valley. So what they've done is they basically said, they didn't hold a gun to the head, but they went to all their big academic medical centers and people in the city and said, okay, it's time for you to figure out a way to start pilots with small companies, with small entrepreneurial companies. One of them's Flatiron, by the way, so not sure they're small anymore, but you know what I mean. And get them to the point where, how do you get them to the point where they can do this, where they can put in the process? And literally, we have a process where, in fact, next week we'll have the second round of this, where 35 odd companies, organizations like big hospitals, visiting nurses, even some organizations like the American Heart Association, are actually proposing to become a host for, we're having a couple of hundred applicants of smaller companies. And the key is you put together a process that they can sign off on, which is a lot of the things that maybe you guys have developed, and they get money. Both sides of the deal get money so they can hire somebody. So you don't have to ask them for money, and they don't have to ask you for equity. Not much, 50 grand each side, but enough to start it going. So this idea is kind of, by the way, there's a proposal out from, I shouldn't tell you guys because we're hoping we'll be the only people who know about this, and there's a proposal out from ONC to do something similar nationally. So this idea about how can you structure this on-board piece is it's not just the two of you who had that idea. So having said that, now you're down the path and you're actually doing this in some evaluation. Talk to me a bit more about actually how you evaluate who you want to work with and who you don't, and how much of this is around literally areas. You said population health and analytics, but what are the crying needs that you're hearing internally, or is it where you think there's a good opportunity outside the hospital?
Well, to the first part of your question, I think that the analysis in terms of sort of who we want to work with or who we're going to work with sort of starts off with sort of the very sort of cliched sort of people, process, and sort of technology. I think there's lots of appealing and sort of sexy technology things that we see, but at the end of the day, a lot of the time is spent in evaluating the teams and working with the entrepreneurs and making sure these are sort of people that are sort of committed, they're sort of passionate around sort of their idea, and they ultimately have the skill set to sort of deliver what's behind them. Obviously, there's a little bit of understanding their experience and skill mix behind that as well. I think that once we have that sort of put in, I just go back to, again, the fund itself, which I think even on the surface may sound sexy because there's dollars associated with it. The real benefit of the fund is not the dollars, especially in today's environment. There's lots of places to raise money. The real value of the fund is ultimately that it's based on Cedars-Sinai Health System, Memorial Care Long Beach, which is the other partner, and combined those two entities have 7 hospitals and 25,000 employees. Those 25,000 employees are ultimately 25,000 advisors, or whatever name they would sort of go by at other investment firms, and we leverage those individuals, depending on the area, to really dig into the solution. And ultimately what we look for is a match between those advisors and the entrepreneurs in the company, and if they together think that, hey, there's something really solid here, and there's something that they can work together to propel it forward, then we sort of make a match. And it's important to us in that we're not just making investments for an investment's sake. We're making an investment in a company that ultimately wants to work with us and is open to working with us because they want to evolve their product. And they in turn believe that we're asking them to evolve the product not as a custom build for Cedars, but ultimately as something that can become a reference architecture or a reference product that can sort of be applied to the rest of the nation.
So give me either some examples of actual companies that are fitting that niche, or some ideas about which areas you're not seeing activity out there, that you could just go and sign a contract with.
I mean, maybe the best example might be sort of in the patient engagement space, sort of generally. So here's a space where obviously there's dozens and hundreds of companies all sort of racing in, trying to figure out sort of this whole sort of consumer digital health angle. And what we find is that while we have pieces of technologies from the large or even our traditional vendors, you named Epic as sort of one of them, we also can sort of step back and see that there's white space or there's holes in terms of how we're going to fill that. And so we're sort of faced with a decision. We can sit back and wait for our traditional companies that we already do business with to sort of continue to expand their product. And in some cases, we will do that. But in many other cases, we don't want to wait. And so it's when we sort of find that gap, but we don't want to wait, we'll go and visit that company.
So are you doing kind of, in a same question first, are you doing kind of internal research by looking around in your organization or doing typical strategy, analysis and review of the marketplace to figure out what you need? How are you getting to those white spaces quickly?
Yeah, like I said, I think that it's coming from both angles. I think there's an ample amount of strategy from the top down of sort of looking what we need and where our holes are. But at the same time, sometimes you don't know what's out there until you know what's out there. And so by visiting, talking with a lot of companies, we sort of end up learning a lot of new things. So I think it sort of happens from both angles.
And the same question, Joanna?
Yeah, it is true that it depends on what the purpose of the relationship is, but we have for a while been responding to companies that came to us, and what we're understanding is because we do want to make effective healthcare solutions and we want to deploy new solutions. We know we have areas that we need to really improve on. So sometimes it's a matter of us defining what our needs are and then doing due diligence and searching in those spaces to see what's out there and whether it's a build versus buy or a combination of those. And other times it's a matter of you have some technology we didn't even know you were working on. We didn't even know it was that you were capable of doing that. And you bring that to us, and we actually try to find out if that would solve some of the many problems that we have in our institution. So it can actually happen in both directions. I would suggest, though, if you're coming to us, we will do our due diligence. So do yours before you come and make sure that you've clearly defined how you distinguish yourself from other things in the market. Right now, the field has grown so fast that there are very few sectors where you're the only one and no one else is doing it. So we'll just both be honest and save each other time and say, there's probably more than one of you, but you do your homework, we'll do ours, and then we'll have a pretty quick, open, transparent conversation about it. I do think that it is important for us to be telling you what our needs are, and sometimes we don't do that well enough. We host a few things called Meetup of the Minds, and we try to get information out there about, wow, we've got these problems, can you help us solve them? And so we're constantly looking for those types of venues, and we're actually going to have a little bit of that tomorrow as well. But I think it's very important that we just consider ourselves partners in finding effective healthcare solutions. The side that we bring at UCSF that's a little bit different, although you are an academic medical center, which I think a lot of people don't know as a private entity that they are, we have tremendous scientific rigor. We have the #1 NIH-funded medical school in the country. And so we have the capacity to do almost any type of research. And when you come to us and you think about doing evaluation, know that we're also shifting our models. And we've created what we consider an oasis of agility inside the institution with the Center for Digital Health Innovation, but we're also pushing hard on clinical trial innovation, because it doesn't make sense for these technologies that are moving so quickly to spend 5 years in a randomized clinical trial. So even the models of evaluation are shifting very rapidly. And I think those are the conversations that it helps to have with groups that come in from the outside.
And just to build on a piece of sort of what you said, probably the most common conversation that we have with companies coming to see us is that they have a very good idea for a product, although when we take a deep look at it, it's not really a product. It's probably more a single piece of function or maybe a couple of pieces of function. And really, I think the conversation is that it takes a tremendous amount of time and energy to stand up a new application or a new product or establish a new relationship with a new vendor. And so it has to sort of be worth the effort. And so we often talk with folks around, it doesn't matter whether it's Epic or Cerner or Athena or any of the sort of the large players in the space. If your idea is something just slightly better, it's probably not yet good enough. It has to ultimately fill a large enough piece or large enough swath of that white space.
This is the last question. How are you helping those folks scale? So now I'm good enough that I make it over your threshold, but you could wait for Epic to bring it out in 2 years. They've just announced Open Epic with Apple. It's going to be something. We'll see, right? How do you help people scale at that point?
The most common way that we work with folks is sort of to turn around sort of the 24,000 advisors that I mentioned, we sort of give them access back to them. And so the companies that we work with stereotypically feel like Cedars and Memorial are their wet labs. And they sort of are connected with folks, not really sort of at a study level. I don't think that we have the depth and the rigor that UCSF has sort of established. I think it's more from a practical implementation. And so we usually will have 1 or 2 pilots going. We'll have an implementation going. It's not uncommon for us to be the largest customer or user of the product. And so I think it's from that sort of real world, day-to-day discovery is, I think, how we're helping those companies scale.
Okay. For the last 5 minutes, Jill looking at me. She's scared that I'm not going to let Jordan finish. Jordan could play to an empty room at the end of the day here. I'd be fine with that. Is he here? No, hasn't shown up yet. I go. We have fun.
Was that a goal? Oh, sorry.
That was the goal. That would be my modest win for the day, better than Wayne Rooney's. Good. Now I'm going to cause trouble. I don't know if you saw Joe Flower this morning, but I was sitting next to him and he was talking about how this is a common thing, and I asked Molly, I mentioned this, I asked Molly Coy, who's UCLA's innovation officer, chief innovation officer, what the response was in her organization when she joined. Because those of you who don't know the Wimberg work about, and the Dartmouth Atlas work about healthcare, is that UCSF is the shining temple on the hill in the Dartmouth Atlas of California, because they do about a third as many touch points and services to patients in their last 6 months of life as happened at UCLA, and Cedars looks more like UCLA than it does like UCSF. So, irrespective of that, both of you are academic medical centers, which have traditionally made money on volume, high intensity of care, and you're talking about building out tools in these areas of population health management, data analysis, big data, which are going to take people away from hospitals, take them away from your doctors, drive them to lower cost, cheaper facilities, and hopefully give them better care. But we're trying to do that triple aim. And somewhere in the triple aim, there is not room for 127 academic medical centers spending and other hospitals spending $900 billion a year collectively between them. We've got to do something about that. But for any organization, this is a typical Silicon Valley thing, right? You don't tend to get that change from within the incumbent behemoth. So how do you two manage that issue? I did ask Molly Coy this question, I'll tell you her answer, but how do you manage this issue? Because if you get too successful, you might be a threat to your own organizations.
Well, I think it depends on what your ultimate goal is. Our ultimate goal is for people to be as well and healthy and have the quality of life that's best, that's optimal for them.
Everyone in healthcare would say that,
right?
Anna, but
So,
come on.
No, seriously.
That's not what any
we
academic
are really testing the new models that are coming. So right now we have bundled payment pilots going on. So we are very, very busy looking at and testing the models. There are some models that were mandated that aren't panning out very well, like the patient-centered medical homes. That study came out and 1 of 11 metrics improved, no decrease to return to hospital, EDs, et cetera. So even though the models are there and that's where the puck is going, we need to be evaluating those models as they're being built. So we're in those pilots very actively testing those things. We want things to get better, and we want patients to be more empowered because we know that's going to make a difference. Patient engagement studies show decreased complications, decreased readmissions. So all of those things, I don't think our incentives are misaligned. If the hospital physical structure doesn't have as many beds in it, we'll fill it with other things, research, education, et cetera. So for us, it's not a matter of trying to hang on to the existing model. We really are aligned in the goal of trying to make healthcare better, get it to more people, and make it less costly.
You think that can come in the DNA of the organization? You think that can be achieved within the DNA of what the UCSF has done to this point?
Oh,
culturally?
I absolutely do. And I think all of these conversations are about aligning incentives. And it's not always easy because when you bring multiple stakeholders to the table, there are going to be polarized views on things. But even coming in as a startup wanting to do a research project, we've got to make sure that it actually fits in with what we want to do. If it sounds like something that won't benefit our patients but might give you information, we probably wouldn't be inclined to do it. So it's really about aligning incentives. I don't mean to sound too Pollyanna. We actually don't care if we lose beds in the hospital, if we've empowered the patients. It's now a different model. It's value-based. It's going to be much more shared risk. Some shared benefit, hopefully, if we do it right, but certainly sharing the risk and empowering our patients, because much of what influences chronic disease is lifestyle choices, which comes back to self-management and patient empowerment.
Darren?
I think
Someone like you at the back.
I think I'd sort of turn around sort of the question just sort of a little bit, and I think it's sort of embedded in your question is that you have sort of these large academic medical centers that sort of have large revenue streams, and why would they want to change? I think it's frankly because they have these large revenue streams that they have the luxury to begin to pursue this. It is obvious that the American healthcare system is going through a change. I don't think it's going to take anybody sort of any rocket science to sort of figure that out. It's a little bit of a guess at sort of that pace of the change and when individual things will happen within that spectrum. But I think that you have a large number of institutions that are in the middle of that and understand that they can participate. And so it's one of these things where I think from a Cedars perspective, and I'm sure these conversations go on in the hallways of other hospitals as well, is given that we know there's a change, we're trying to understand how to participate in that. I think participating, it gives you a little bit more of a sense of control, and so that you can sort of figure it out. Sure, there's people sort of in our hallways that, wish, it was just like the good old days. But I think you have that sort of in any industry or sort of any company. I think the reality is that for all of the right reasons that, might sound sort of overly altruistic, I think, these health systems were established to help folks, and I think people are sort of really rethinking how to redo those models. And included in those models, I think, is a real understanding that many of these hospitals were started off and meant to be sort of a community hub or a community benefit. And by sort of pursuing some of these more sort of value-based models, there's a way to sort of get this healthcare pushed more into the community and away from that center.
Well, I'll close with what Molly Coy at UCLA told me, was that she was in the meeting when she first sort of discussed all this stuff they were going to do and how they could do innovation and how they could reduce bed days and reduce revenue and that kind of stuff. And the CEO, afterwards, she met him in the corridor and said, that was a bit tough. Do you think that's going to be okay? And he said, no, we should be doing that. So maybe if UCLA can be doing that, and big medical centers across the country, even New York City can be doing that, maybe we should be optimistic and Pollyannish. On the other hand, maybe England will win the World Cup one day. Unlikely. That's possibly equally unlikely.
We're so sorry.
Thank Anna. Thank Darren so much.
That was awesome. Exactly what I wanted. Thank you.